dawn-to-dusk curfew in Los Angeles was lifted last night with no new reports of violence. But the fear has not lifted, even though 7,000 National Guardsmen, Marines, and police are on patrol. Phil Schuman has more on the slow return to normalcy in Los Angeles.
Queen 114, Queen 114.
The curfew was gone, but tension remained on the streets of South Los Angeles, the police presence still heavy. Longtime residents like Rosalind Abels were cautious even doing the simplest things, like making a trip to a fast food restaurant.
I'm still a little nervous, but I'm glad that it's lifted and things are getting back to normal.
And Los Angeles is still very much a city under military occupation. Thousands of Army, Marine, and National Guard troops remain, backing up the Los Angeles police.
I have no indication at this point either when they're going to pull out or that their pullout is imminent.
And all across Los Angeles, groups are mobilizing to help, to offer resources in the rebuilding process. Like this group calling itself Heal LA, people working on food, clothing, and politics.
They want to do their part to address the underlying issues that led to the violence that we've been having, the racism, the lack of opportunity for people, not only in South Central, but for people of color in general, and poor people in this country.
Poor people now made poorer by the destruction of jobs, businesses, life. But the plan now is to rebuild the city better than it was before. Phil Schuman, NBC News, Los Angeles.
The White House reaction to the violence in Los Angeles is angering Democrats. The Bush administration says the violence was the result of welfare programs enacted in the 1960s and 70s. White House correspondent Jim Miklashevsky has more.
New York Congressman Charles Rangel on the phone to the White House, and he's angry.
It's kind of urgent, and I just wanted to know what the hell happened this morning.
Rangel claims he's been double-crossed. He says Bush Budget Director Dick Darman assured him President Bush was ready to put aside partisan politics and deal seriously with inner-city problems. But Bush aimed a shot at Congress, implying that the L.A. riots may never have happened if Congress had only passed his programs.
If people had listened to some of our cabinet departments up on the Hill, we might be a little further along.
If we're talking about enterprise zones, this is going to mean to provide incentives for people to come into Los Angeles, and it's going to be tax incentives? Is the president out of his mind?
Bush did propose enterprise zones to give tax breaks to companies that locate in the inner city. But he vetoed a tax bill that contained enterprise zones, and it's never been on his list of high priorities. Spokesman Marlon Fitzwater only threw fuel on the fire. He blamed last week's violence on the failed social programs of the 60s and 70s.
This garbage that has been reported out by Fitzwater means that the president is not even in this century.
If the nation's inner cities are looking to Washington for help, it could be a long, hot political year. Jim Miklashevsky, NBC News at the White House.
For his part, Democratic presidential candidate Bill Clinton says new solutions must be found for America's racial problems. Touring ravaged areas of Los Angeles, Clinton said neither government giveaways nor Republican neglect can solve the problems. The Arkansas governor met separately with members of the African American, Hispanic, and Korean communities. He also met with a predominantly white group of firefighters. Though the curfew has been lifted in Los Angeles, it remains in effect in at least one nearby suburb. Colin Nolan reports that the city officials there are opting for caution.
There was a curfew on in Long Beach, but not the kind of curfew which would keep a few people from walking the dog or concentrating on a game of chess. It was, however, enough of one to close most stores early and keep the few which remained open from making much of a profit.
Usually at this time of the night, there's crowds, people walking up and down. It's a very neighborhood-oriented community, and right now there's nobody on the streets.
Despite the fact similar curfews had been lifted elsewhere in Los Angeles County, city officials here decided to bring life back to normal slowly.
I think if it flares a second time, it'll be harder to stop a second time. So I think being somewhat conservative sounds like a good idea.
Despite the fact you're violating curfew right now.
I guess so.
I think everyone's sick of being cooped up in their houses, so they're trying to get out and get some fresh air and stuff.
After getting only 5 hours sleep in their first 48 hours of duty, members of the 1st Light Armored Infantry Battalion from Camp Pendleton were back on the street, well rested after spending the day in their barracks a parking garage at the Long Beach Plaza. City officials say the curfew has been a success, in large measure to the U.S. Marines, who, although they haven't fired a shot, have established a presence here in this community and have helped restore order to the streets. Conan Noble, NBC News, Long Beach, California.
Meantime, the Rodney King verdict is being partially blamed for violence last night in Toronto, Canada. 25 people were arrested and 7 hurt when riot police clashed with a crowd of demonstrators. Authorities say the King verdict and the fatal shooting of a black drug suspect by Toronto police set off the disturbance. In other news, bad news for President Bush just before today's primaries in Indiana, North Carolina, and the District of Columbia. A new Los Angeles Times Mirror poll found that if the presidential elections were held today, it would be a 3-way dead heat. The poll, which has a 3% margin of error, was conducted last Thursday through Sunday following the Rodney King verdict and the violence in Los Angeles. The stork picked an unlikely landing spot in New York Monday. While many people have bought the Brooklyn Bridge, Ariel Elisa Delgado yesterday became one of the first to be born on the Brooklyn Bridge. Lisa, who weighed in at 7 pounds 15 ounces, arrived while her mother was being driven to the hospital. Hospital officials say that mother and daughter are both reported to be doing well this morning. We'll have more news, the weather, and the day in business after this. Stock prices rallied strongly yesterday. The Dow Jones Industrials gained more than 42 points to a new record closing high of 3,378.13. Looking ahead to today's market, here's the Wall Street Journal's Connie Mitchell. Good morning, Connie. Good morning. Could the stock market get hit by the big Treasury bond sale today?
Many of the analysts we talked to don't believe so. They say momentum in the stock market is so strong right now that it would take really bad results at the auction before stock investors stop to notice. In fact, they say the yield on the long bond would have to shoot up beyond 8% to have much effect, and they don't think that will happen.
How big is the auction?
$36 billion of securities the Treasury will be selling over a 3-day period. This is what they call the quarterly refunding of the federal debt, when Uncle Sam comes into the market to borrow a huge amount of money to pay the bills that have been accumulating from the federal deficit. It starts today with the sale of 3-year notes, $15 billion worth.
All right. Thank you so much, Connie Mitchell. Time now for a look at the weather and record highs in the west. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Ann. Yes, indeed. Feeling like summertime. 90s in the far west. Take a look at the satellite photograph. You see all those clear skies over Washington, Idaho. We'll see some 90s into both of those states. Boise hitting 90 degrees. Medford probably above 90 degrees. With that warmth in the southwest, some strong thunderstorms likely in portions of Arizona and the desert areas of California. And in the northeast, cold, in fact, cold enough for some snow in the mountains of Pennsylvania and West Virginia as that cold air dips down over the Great Lakes. 40s for afternoon highs. If you like it real cold, try Barrow at 6 degrees this morning. That is my national weather. Now here's what's happening in your neighborhood. For Chicago, a high of only 52 degrees today. 85 degrees at Dallas-Fort Worth. Miami, 86 degrees. Minneapolis going up to a high of 61 degrees. Seattle could be another record breaker, 83 degrees by the afternoon. And in just a few more minutes, the travel weather. Ann?
All right, thanks, Joe. In the NBA playoffs, the Clippers sail into the sunset. The sports report is next after this. In sports, the Utah Jazz are singing a winning tune this morning. They advanced to the Western Conference semifinals with a victory over the LA Clippers last night. In the 5th and deciding game of their first-round series, Utah overcame a 15-point deficit to win 98-89. The Jazz will now play Seattle. Meantime, in the Eastern Conference semifinals, Boston beat Cleveland 104-98, tying that series at a game apiece. In the Stanley Cup playoffs, Chicago has taken a 2-0 lead over Detroit after last night's 3-1 victory. And Vancouver blanked Edmonton 4-0, tying their series 1-1. In baseball, the first-place Pirates scored 11 runs in the 6th inning and went on to slam Cincinnati 12-5. It was Pittsburgh's biggest inning since 1942. Elsewhere in the National League, Atlanta beat the Cubs and the Mets grounded the Astros. In the American League, Baltimore's winning streak now stands at 6. Chris Hoyles blasted a grand slam to power the first-place Orioles past Texas 8-5. Toronto topped Oakland to stay percentage points behind in the East. The Yankees sank the Mariners. Chicago's Alex Fernandez one-hit Milwaukee. Minnesota ripped the Red Sox.
Detroit clubbed California. And in Cleveland, Neil Heaton of Kansas City threw a pitch behind Albert Bell, who took exception to Heaton's aim. When peace was restored, Heaton and Bell were ejected, and KC went on to an 11-6 victory.
And former World Series hero Kirk Gibson says he'll probably retire after being released by the Pirates. The news continues in just a moment. You're watching NBC News at sunrise. Here's some of the stories we're following this Tuesday morning on NBC News at sunrise. For the first time since last week, a night without a curfew in Los Angeles. An unappealing verdict from the Supreme Court. Entertainer and lawmaker George Murphy has died. When a person dies under suspicious circumstances, a medical specialist is called in. Some medical examiners or coroners are renowned for their skillful detective work. Others are less distinguished, and a few become notorious. Jim Cummins takes another look at a controversial Texas coroner.
It's a huge controversy involving Dr. Ralph Erdman. He's a pathologist who has helped decide thousands of criminal and civil cases in dozens of counties throughout West Texas for more than 25 years. He was indicted in February for falsifying evidence in one county, and that started a chain of events that has raised questions about all of the autopsies Erdman has done. He performed many of his autopsies here in an abandoned shack on the outskirts of Amarillo. The authorities declared it a health hazard and set it on fire. Defense lawyer Jeff Blackburn.
I think that events that are developing now are finally beginning to shed light on exactly who this man is and what he has done in order to subvert truth and in order to subvert justice now for many years.
Blackburn was Johnny Frank Garrett's lawyer. Garrett was 17 when he was convicted of raping and beating to death Sister Tadia Benz, a 76-year-old Catholic nun. Garrett was given the death penalty because under Texas law, murder and rape together are considered a capital offense, so evidence in both is necessary for a death sentence. But Garrett's lawyer says proof of rape was not certain because Erdman lost the key piece of evidence.
Erdman testified that he lost the semen sample, that it could never be tested again, and that because of that, there was no way anyone could know, and that we would just have to take his word that it proved that Garrett was the person that committed the crime.
The jury did. Garrett was sentenced to death. Even the Pope pleaded for mercy in this case, but to no avail. Garrett was executed in February.
That man was executed because the government, the court system, was willing to just take the word of Dr. Erdman.
Prosecutor Randy Sherrod admits Erdman does make mistakes.
I've known the entire time I've worked with Dr. Erdman that his work was questionable from the standpoint of getting a left and a right mixed up. What do? Do you let 150 murderers go because a guy has testified before that the left was a right and the right was a left?
It's been a lucrative business for Erdman, who was paid $140,000 a year in one county, $600 for each autopsy he performed in 40 other counties. And now there are allegations that Erdman's wife sold human corpses to a bone distribution company for $200 apiece. Prosecutor Sherrod has reportedly described Erdman as a kook and a nut because there are charges he's botched some potential murder cases as well. In 1988, young Tate Rowland was found hanging from this tree. Erdman ruled his death a suicide, even though drugs were found in the boy's blood. 3 years later, Rowland's sister Terry died after choking on her own vomit, and Erdman ruled her death was accidental, even though she too had drugs in her blood. Both bodies were exhumed after the family complained, and a second autopsy by another pathologist has led to the arrest of a man who's been charged with murder in Terry's death. So why did the authorities keep using Erdman?
What else do you do? This area isn't real conducive to getting pathologists to come to this area.
Defense lawyers are not sympathetic.
They have really created a Frankenstein and now are having to deal with all the wreckage that he's caused.
Legal authorities all over West Texas will be picking through that wreckage for a long time to determine just how many autopsies Dr. Ralph Erdman botched. Jim Cummins, NBC News, Dallas.
We'll have more news, Money Magazine's Jordan Goodman on business, and Joe Whitty's weather when we return. A quiet night in Los Angeles tops our news this morning. Troops continued to patrol the streets, but in Los Angeles, it was the first night in a week without a curfew. Mayor Tom Bradley says he hopes it's a sign that things are returning to normal. President Bush will visit the riot-torn city on Thursday. He's already pledged federal help to rebuild the devastated areas. Chief Financial Correspondent Mike Jensen says there's a lot to do.
Looted, burned out, destroyed, from mom-and-pop stores to national chains. They have a decision to make. Will they come back? California Governor Pete Wilson says many told him they will.
They were impressed by the fact that people in the neighborhoods came out to help them clean up.
They're also impressed by the fact that they can make a lot of money. Several Boys markets were looted, but Boys is staying.
We're still profitable here. You know, this is our neighborhood. And
property owners also are staying to salvage their investment. The owners of this mini mall are only partially covered by insurance. They'd probably take a big loss if they sold. The cleanup also is an opportunity to do the rebuilding.
We're with Clemens Construction, and we're specialists in fire reconstruction.
Will they all reopen? No. Some of the small businesses have no insurance, and some have no faith that things won't get out of hand again. But for many merchants, this neighborhood is their best chance to make a profit. Mike Jensen, NBC News, Los Angeles.
Some of the merchandise taken from stores at the height of the disorders is going back to its rightful owners. Details from David Garcia.
Police and National Guardsmen are recovering stolen loot by the truckload. As overwhelming as the looting was, so is the recovery.
We went out, we hit about 10 locations. We came back, and there's 36 more.
An amazing variety, from a washing machine to diet food, and all kinds of electronics. And what thrills the police is that people in the community are calling in, telling them where the loot and the looters are.
These people are more than willing to call up and identify themselves and say, this is where I live, and if you check this place across the street from where I live, you're going to find this.
And from those in possession of stolen property, some pretty tall tales of how they got it.
They said some guy drove up here and they bought an entire house full of furniture for $60.
Beyond the couches, beyond the washing machines, police are especially concerned about other stolen property, guns. But for now, the police are trying to keep up with the incoming tide of stolen loot and enjoying the show of support from the community. I'm David Garcia, NBC News, Los Angeles.
In other news, the Supreme Court has handed down the latest in a series of decisions that will make it tougher to appeal state-level convictions. Ruling on a manslaughter case from Oregon, the justices limited the rights of prisoners to bring evidence before federal judges. George Murphy, whose career brought him prominence in both the show business and government industries, has died in Florida at the age of 89. Murphy was a song and dance man on Broadway and in the movies, and in 1964, California voters gave him a term in the U.S. Senate. A musical about the life of jazz pioneer Jelly Roll Morton has captured the most Tony Award nominations this year. Jelly's Last Jam was nominated for Best Musical and in 10 other categories. 9 nominations went to Crazy for You, an old-style musical with songs by George and Ira Gershwin. When we return, Money Magazine's Jordan Goodman tells us how the small investor is doing, and Joe Whitty has the travel look. A small profit for the small investor last week. Data gathered from Money Magazine's Small Investor Index indicates the value of the average portfolio gained $135 last week. It's now worth $45,791. Joining us now is Money Magazine's Jordan Goodman. Good morning, Jordan.
Good morning, Ann.
Now, you have been reporting in the past about the billions of dollars that have been going into these junk bond mutual funds, but now you're saying something has changed.
That's right. $2.3 billion went into junk bond funds in the first 3 months of the year. But in April, that really changed quite dramatically. Just that one fund, for example, the Kemper funds, had brought in $95 million the first 3 months. $97 million went out in April. People seem to be taking profits.
What's turning the small investor away from these junk bonds?
Well, 2 things. First of all, they've had enormous gains. People who've been in them for, say, a year or so have been up 50% or more because they were very depressed last year during the recession, and they are anticipating a recovery. Secondly, the yields are much lower now than they used to be. The spread between those and treasuries is much less. You can now get about 10% on a junk bond. A year ago, you could get 14%, so they're not quite as attractive.
Do you know why all that's happened?
Well,
why the yields have dropped?
The yields have dropped because many of these junk bond funds had these very high-yielding bonds, 14 and 15%, that have been called. Many of the companies have said, well, we want to have a 10% instead of 15%. So that's why they have much lower yields.
Where are these investors moving into?
They're going into growth stocks, and we saw that yesterday with the stock market moving to new record highs. They're seeing much better profit opportunities in growth stocks than junk bonds right now.
What's your advice, though, for people who are still holding these junk bonds and are now maybe unsure about what to do with them?
Lower your expectations, because people were going into them for big gains. Now that they've had big gains, they should not expect that in the future. If you can earn your 10 or 11%, be happy, but don't expect 50% again for the next year.
So you're telling them to stay put or to move?
For yield, yes, but not as a gain play. For gains, go for the stock funds.
So, and your advice then, the people who have moved then into growth funds, are they doing the right thing?
I think so. For the long term particularly, stocks have more upside. The economy is recovering, and that's where you're going to have much better gains than junk bond funds.
So they're not willing to jump when these growth stocks get scary, then they should be okay.
That's right.
All right. Thank you so much, Jordan Goodman.
Thanks, Ann.
Stay put. All right. Thanks. Time now for a look at the travel weather with Joe.
Thank you, Ann. And if you're traveling out to the west, be sure to take your golf gloves or swimsuit. It's a heat wave out west. Temperatures in the 90s, all due to a warm flow coming up from Mexico up over the western mountain states. In contrast, a chilly Canadian flow over the Great Lakes in the northeast. So city highs in the northeast will be about 20 degrees below normal, 50s and 40s. But we'll see 94 degrees at Medford, 90 way up north at Glasgow, Montana, and in the south, warm, typical 85 degrees in Dallas-Fort Worth. Now, travelers today will find some possible airport delays at Las Vegas due to some thunderstorms, possibly, and also at Phoenix. Pittsburgh, Louisville, some fog, and Washington, D.C., some light rain may cause some minor delays during the course of the day. And we'll see the area of rain spreading along the mid-Atlantic coast as a slow-moving frontal system moves up the coast ever so slowly. A chance of some snow in the mountains of western Pennsylvania and also West Virginia. Not much, but surprising for the month of May. Travel safe. Ann?
All right. Thanks, Joe. That's NBC News at Sunrise this Tuesday morning. I'm Ann Curry. We'll see you tomorrow.